Friend, have you ever said something about yourself that starts out like, I'm just, and you fill in the blank? Maybe it's, I'm just bad with money. I'm just anxious. I'm always the responsible one, or I'm terrible at relationships. Or even just the blanket statement of, this is just how I am. We say these things so casually sometimes, almost like we're reading from our own instruction manual. Like, this is me. This is how I work. These are my settings. But have you ever stopped and wondered, who wrote that? Who ingrained that in me? Because we aren't born with a complete understanding of who we are. And really, we are still building that understanding every day. Some of that understanding comes from our actual experiences. We try something, something happens, we learn from it. But we also build our understanding of ourselves from what other people tell us about who we are. From what gets us praise to gets criticism to what gets us attention and what seems to create connection or seems to get us rejected. We learn from what we watch other people do. We learn from the roles we find ourselves playing, and sometimes we make conclusions about ourselves from experiences we didn't fully understand when they happened. Then we carry those conclusions forward. After a while, the story becomes so familiar, we stop remembering that it was a story to begin with. We just say, that's just who I am. Today, I want to get curious about some of those stories, not because we need to dig through our entire history looking for something to heal, or that we need to identify every limiting belief and replace it with a shinier, more positive one, but because I think sometimes we can get a little too focused on healing or fixing. Sometimes we just need to notice, get curious, and maybe discover that something we've been calling our personality is actually a conclusion we made a long time ago. Let's talk about it. Hello, and welcome to Torches, Yoga and Mindfulness. I'm Lauren, and I'll be your coach. If you're curious about mindfulness, healing, and practical habits that actually work, you're in the right place. Here we focus on simple but powerful practices grounded in ancient wisdom and modern science to care for both our mind and body. So make sure you hit that like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. So, the original inspiration for this conversation actually came from an article I read in Psychology Today by therapist Elizabeth Lamott about something she calls incomplete family stories. But that got me thinking, because families don't only pass down names and recipes, traditions, and holiday arguments, we also pass down stories. Stories about who we are, what our family is like, what happened in the past, what people like us do, and what success looks like, how safe the world is. They pass on whether money is abundant or always just one emergency away from disappearing. They tell us whether rest is something deserved or earned, whether emotions are something we talk about or something you quietly should suppress alone. There's so much of our perspective we inherit. And one of the ideas that Lamont explores is that these stories aren't necessarily false, more like they're incomplete, especially when we're kids. Because when we're young, we're constantly trying to understand what's happening around us. But we only have the information and developmental capacity available to us at that time. So our mind fills in the blanks. Maybe you were always the shy one. People would describe you like that. Nobody meant anything harmful by it. Maybe you actually were shy. But eventually, like for me, when I regularly heard Lauren shy around new people, to me that quietly became, I am a shy person. And now it's not describing something that I sometimes experience. All of a sudden, it's just describing me and who I am as a person. And the flip side of that experience can set the tone for our inner critic. Like maybe you had a sibling who was called the smart one. Now, no one ever sat you down and said you were dumb or not smart, but your little mind did the math. Maybe you grew up in a family where money was tight and you heard some versions of, we can't afford that over and over. So maybe the story your brain built was, money is always precarious. Maybe being easygoing got you praise. You were the kid who never caused trouble or the one everybody could count on. And maybe nobody ever told you that having needs was a problem, but you noticed how much connection and approval came from not having them. So eventually, you became the person who says, no, really, I'm fine, even when you very much are not fine. And here's the real kicker. While we're getting so many stories from our families, they aren't the only storytellers. We get stories from school, from peers, from culture, religion, relationships, the workplace, social media, and sometimes from individual experiences that happened once but left a really big impression on us. Maybe someone rejected you, so the story becomes I'm too much. Someone betrayed you, so the story becomes people can't be trusted. Maybe you tried something, failed spectacularly, and your brain decided we don't do things like that. And I want to make an important distinction here. None of this requires somebody intentionally teaching us a limiting belief. Sometimes nobody ever actually said the sentence. We wrote the sentence ourselves from the information available to us. And our brains are actually very good at doing this. In psychology, there's something called a schema or schema. It's basically a mental framework that helps us organize and interpret information. We develop schemas about all kinds of things like relationships, other people, the world, and importantly for this conversation, about ourselves. Schemas are useful. Think of them almost like schematics. They're these mental frameworks in our brain that were built from what we've learned and experienced. They help us organize our basic understanding of the world, other people, ourselves, and our experiences. Our brains encounter an enormous amount of information every day, and we can't stop and completely reevaluate everything from scratch every single time something happens. So, with the schemas, our brains don't have to start from scratch with each new moment. Y'all know Blanche, the spirally side of my brain. She doesn't have time to reopen the complete historical record every time somebody asks if we're like good at public speaking. She skims the file real quick, like, oh, public speaking? Yeah, we don't do that. We hate that. Moving on. Our brains use previous experiences to help us interpret what's happening now and anticipate what might happen, which can be really efficient, but it can also create some problems. Sometimes new experiences get interpreted through our mind's old framework. If somewhere along the way, like say I developed a story that people eventually leave me, I may become particularly sensitive to signs that someone is pulling away. Maybe one day they just happen to be busy and take a little longer than usual to text back. Or they're distracted, or something feels a little different in their voice. Then my brain is going to go, see, here it comes. They're about to pull away. If my story is I'm bad at things like this, then one mistake carries a lot more weight. The 10 things I did well might barely register, but that one mistake goes straight into the evidence locker. If my story is I'm the person who holds everything together, then asking for help isn't going to just feel unfamiliar. It's going to feel like I am violating something about who I am. We actually talked recently about confirmation bias. I mention it a lot because it comes into play a lot. It's the way our brains tend to notice information that supports what we already believe. Our stories about ourselves work the same way. They are part of that biased filter. Once I believe something about who I am, my attention can become very good at finding evidence that fits. And again, that doesn't mean your brain is secretly plotting against you. It just means your brain is using previous information to interpret current experiences. And using mindfulness is what allows us to make that distinction. And it puts us in a powerful place of freedom and choice. So, this is where things get really interesting. Because, see, there's a difference between saying, I struggled to make friends when I was younger, and saying, I'm socially awkward. One describes the experience we had, and the other describes me. There's a difference between I didn't follow through on that goal and I never stick with anything, or I've been overwhelmed lately versus I'm terrible at handling stress. Can you feel that difference? Our language can quietly fuse an experience with our identity. Something happened, then it happened again, maybe other people even noticed it. Then a conclusion is formed. The conclusion got repeated, and eventually this happened to me became this is who I am. That's where mindfulness becomes incredibly useful because our words have power. Last week we talked about becoming the observer of what's happening inside of us. We talked about meta awareness, which is our ability to notice our own mental activity. We don't only think, we can notice what we are thinking. And we can do the same thing with these identity stories. Instead of identifying with the thought, I'm not the type of person who asks for help, try replacing it with, I have a story that I'm not a person who asks for help. Just notice what happens there. We haven't changed the story. We aren't arguing with it or replacing it with some fluff thoughts like, I am a beautifully independent yet perfectly interdependent person who joyfully receives assistance from others. We don't need to do all that. All we've done is move it slightly from this is a fact about me to this is something I believe about me. And when we do that, then we can look at it as opposed to absorbing it. That tiny bit of distance gives us room for curiosity, and that is mindfulness. So I want to give you a little practice you can take with you this week. You don't need a journal, although you can absolutely write this down if that's going to be helpful for you. So just think of one sentence you've repeated about yourself. You can start with, like, I'm the kind of person who, or maybe listen for one of those sentences that starts with, I'm just, I've always been, I could never, or people like me don't. Pick one, and we're not going to try to get rid of it. We're just going to get curious about it. First, we're going to ask, where did I learn this? Not asking who told me this, because maybe nobody ever explicitly said it. Maybe it was something you concluded. So the question is, when did you first remember feeling this way about yourself? What experiences reinforced this? Was there a role you learned to play? Was there something about this belief that helped you feel like you belonged? Did it protect you somehow or help you understand something that was confusing at the time? And this doesn't have to be a whole like investigation discovery. We're not standing in front of a corkboard with red string trying to identify and connect the precise moment in 1996 when your fear of disappointing people began. We're just getting curious. And then I want you to ask, what might be the most useful question in this exercise? Is this the whole story? We aren't labeling it incomplete or stupid, right or concrete. You're not here to ask if it's a fact or how to get rid of it, because there may be truth in it. Maybe you have had a tendency to quit things. Maybe you really do feel uncomfortable in group settings. Maybe you've spent most of your life taking care of other people, and maybe you do tend to worry. You're not trying to argue yourself out of your lived experiences. You're just looking a little deeper to see if there is information missing from the story. If never follow through is your story, maybe that becomes, I've struggled to follow through when I've tried to change too much at one time. But there are also plenty of things I've consistently shown up for. Both can absolutely be true. Maybe if your story is that you are too sensitive or too much, that becomes, I feel things, and there have been times when I haven't known what to do with everything I was feeling. If yours sounds like, I have to do everything myself, it can turn into, I learned to rely heavily on myself because there were times when I had to. That doesn't mean I have to do everything alone now. You see where we're going with this? We're not replacing negative stories with positive ones. We're making incomplete stories more complete and accurate. And what's really cool is this doesn't just help us to better understand our whole selves, it might even change the way we understand the people we inherited some of these stories from. There are probably things from our family that we need to and want to carry forward. Resilience, humor, resourcefulness, work ethic, loyalty, traditions, or ways for caring of people. There can be beautiful things that get passed down, and there may also be things that don't quite fit anymore. That's why I don't necessarily think we need to turn every one of these conversations into breaking generational cycles or healing family trauma type of thing. The goal is to just become conscious of what we're carrying. And with a new perspective, we may even realize that the stories we inherited weren't the whole story about the person who gave them to us either. If your mom worried constantly as a child, you could have understood it as that's just how she is. But now adult you might know things about her life that little you didn't. Maybe she had experiences under those worries. If your dad worked constantly, what you could have seen and concluded was this is how responsible adults act and do. This is what they do. But there may have been fear underneath that overworked dad. Maybe he experienced financial instability at one time or another, or there was a story he inherited about what it meant to be a provider for the family. Understanding these things doesn't mean we have to excuse harmful behavior, and it doesn't mean that we have to go digging around for explanations for everything our families ever did. It simply means we have more information now than we did when we first created some of these stories. We can hold a more complete picture. And I think that's especially important as we continue this conversation that we've been having this month about becoming more grounded in ourselves. We've listened to our bodies. We've talked about imagining where we're going instead of demanding that we have our whole future figured out. We've looked at the habits that help us become more resilient. We've talked about building trust with ourselves, and we've practiced stepping into that observer seat and noticing what's happening inside our minds without immediately becoming whatever thought or mood happens to be passing through. And now we can look a little deeper at what our mind has learned to believe about the person living inside it. Because being grounded doesn't mean being permanently rooted in every idea we've ever had about ourselves. Sometimes being grounded means we feel steady enough to look at what we've been standing in and ask, do I still believe this? If uncertainty comes up, that's okay. You don't have to rewrite your entire life today or in this one exercise. Maybe this week you just notice one sentence, one of those I'm just or I've always been's. And when you hear it, instead of immediately believing it or fighting it or trying to fix yourself, just get curious. Like, where did I learn that? Or is this the whole story? Because some of the things we've spent years trying to heal or fix aren't proof that something inside us needs repairing. Maybe they're just old conclusions, and we just need to complete the information and update things. And we're going to pick up here in our next conversation because once we recognize an old story, the next natural question becomes what happens when we give ourselves new experiences that don't quite fit that story? But for today, don't try to become someone new. Just notice the stories you've been using to explain who you already are. And maybe leave a little room for the possibility that there's more to the story. Friend, thank you so much for sharing a piece of your day with me. Stay present, stay kind to yourself, and I will see you soon.